For blood test number 7 in 2025, using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, we saw that my biological age was 15 years younger than the chronological. And if you missed that video, it'll be in the right corner. But what might be contributing to these data? So let's start off with prescription meds. And for those who are familiar with the channel, you already know this story, so apologies, I'll have to go through it again for people who may be new. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my 20s, so I've been taking thyroid hormone medication for about 30 years, with the most recent iteration including levothyroxine, 75 micrograms per day, and 20 micrograms per day of Cytomel, which then brings us to supplements. And for this test, I specifically targeted supplements for NAD, including nicotinic acid, nicotinamide, and NMN, and not all at the same time, on separate days, one at a time, but also homocysteine, including riboflavin, betaine, or trimethylglycine, which is TMG, and zinc. Now note that none of these supplements were specifically aimed at lowering biological age. And for those who may not know, this biological age calculator is a blood-based biomarker calculator that includes 9 clinical chemistry biomarkers. This isn't an epigenetic test. So none of these supplements were directly aimed at improving biological age. And when considering this most recent test of 15 years younger, it's actually my worst data thus far over 7 tests. One could make the argument that all of these supplements didn't do anything for improving my biomarker data and potentially maybe even made some of the biological age metrics worse. But that's a story and analysis for another day. So for now, let's dig into the details in terms of how much of each of these supplements that I supplemented with for this blood test. So first, I supplemented with nicotinic acid an average of 17 milligrams per day. And that number may seem strange as you can't get supplements in 17 milligrams per day. So I've mentioned this in earlier videos. I make my own stock solution of nicotinic acid, but also riboflavin, and then take an aliquot of that every day, or when I'm taking it, 20 milliliters or 50 milliliters, and I get my daily dose of those 2 supplements by making that stock solution. And I know I have to make a video on both of those at some point, so stay tuned for that video at some point in the future. So I averaged 17 milligrams per day, which means I didn't take it for every day during the 40-day period that corresponded to this blood test. And in terms of that 41-day period, it started immediately after September 16th, which was on the day of test number 6. And it lasted until the day before test number 7 on October 26th. So there were 41 days in between blood tests. So I'm looking at 41-day averages from one test until the next. So again, I only supplemented with nicotinic acid for a few days during this period. And that's because I also supplemented with nicotinamide on separate days with an average of 98 milligrams per day for that 41-day average. Now note that nicotinamide comes in 500 milligram capsules. So this is approximately one day of supplementation with nicotinamide for every 5 days. So I wasn't taking that every day either. And that's because the primary NAD intervention included NMN. And for NMN, I supplemented with an average of 1,000 milligrams per day from October 10th through October 26th. So the 17-day period before measuring NAD and all of the other blood test biomarkers. Now note that NAD levels are, in my case, sensitive to change very quickly with just 2 to 3 days of supplementation or taking supplements out. So with that in mind, although NMN's average over that 17-day period was 1,000 milligrams per day, for the 4 days before testing, it was less, 375 milligrams per day, as I supplemented with 3 of the 4 days with 500 milligrams per day of NMN. And I did that because I don't generally get headaches, and I don't know if the two are related, but for some reason I started to get headaches on days using more than 500 milligrams per day of either NMN or in the past nicotinamide, which is strange because when I supplemented with NMN for earlier blood tests, I've supplemented now with 3 or 4 blood tests using NMN, the headaches weren't present. So I don't know if this is a phenomenon that's caused by nicotinamide or NMN, as NMN contains nicotinamide, or something else. But to be safe, I cut the dose down of both nicotinamide and NMN for this period when I supplemented with it. So what was the impact on NAD of supplementing with NMN for this 17-day period, but more specifically for the 4-day period with a lower dose before testing? So to find out, I sent blood to Genfinity for NAD analysis, and if you want to measure your own NAD levels using this test, there's a discount link in the video's description. So on October 27th, the same day as testing everything else, NAD levels were about 48 micromolar. And you can see it's highlighted in green. Genfinity flags that as good news, as anything for them greater than 40 is considered quote-unquote optimal. I'm not yet sure what's optimal for NAD, whether it's 40 or above 40, 40 to 60. In my case, based on metabolomic analysis, data closer to 30 may be optimal, as my data tends to be on the lower side without any NAD precursors. And I'm using metabolomic correlations, so correlations for NAD with other metabolites, to try to get a more complete picture of what may be optimal for NAD in my case. For direct comparison, for the previous test, for test number 6, NAD levels were 21 micromolar. And note that that was using nicotinamide exclusively. So this is an interesting comparison. NMN is nicotinamide mononucleotide. And obviously we've got nicotinamide by itself. So the inclusion of that mononucleotide is sufficient to get a big boost for NAD levels relative to only looking at nicotinamide by itself, 48 micromolar versus 21 micromolar. Now, in terms of why I got such a big jump at a relatively low dose of NMN, just 4 days before testing 375 milligrams per day, it's possible that the average of 1,000 milligrams per day for that 17-day period is what drove the higher NAD level. All right, so I also mentioned that I'm taking supplements aimed at lowering homocysteine. So first, why is homocysteine important? So it's directly neurotoxic, at least in cells, in neurons, and it causes endothelial cell senescence. So these are two major reasons why I'm measuring homocysteine for every test. So with that in mind, let's take a look at my data, which is what we'll see here. So for this test, on the same day as testing everything else, not just biological age, homocysteine was 9.3 micromolar, which then raises the question, what's optimal? So based on the reference range, anything greater than 15 micromolar would be flagged as high. So technically, my data in comparison to the reference range would be quote unquote good. But I have more specific targets, and that's based on the published literature. This isn't just me making up numbers out of nowhere, out of thin air. So for homocysteine, lower is better, and I have a 5 micromolar target. But that's only part of the story. And that's because homocysteine increases during aging. So that 5 micromolar target and avoiding an age-related increase for homocysteine are what I consider as optimal. And besides homocysteine, if you're interested in what's optimal for biomarkers, I have a new Patreon tier dedicated specifically to that. It doesn't yet include homocysteine, but it includes 35 other biomarkers that are shown here, more than 2 hours of video content, 52 published references that are also on this tier. And these aren't the reference ranges, which you can get from any LLM these days. This is what may be optimal based on how each of these biomarkers changes during aging and or their associations with all-cause mortality risk. So if you're interested in that, check it out. All right, so back to the data. And based on that less than 5 micromolar target, we can see that 9.3 is higher than that. So that we give that an X, a red X, bad news. And in terms of avoiding the age-related increase for homocysteine, there too, red X. And I covered that in the last video in this series, blood test number 6 analysis, and I'll link to that video in the right corner in case you missed it. So for now though, let's do a direct test-to-test comparison, as I want to illustrate supplemental changes that I made test over test that didn't make a dent on lowering homocysteine, including betaine, increasing betaine supplementation. So first note that homocysteine was 8.8 for the September test, and it actually moved a bit in the wrong direction for this test, 9.3 micromolar. So for the previous test, 8.8, to this most recent test, I increased trimethylglycine supplementation to almost 5 grams per day. And I know a lot of people think that this is the best way to lower homocysteine, but we can see that in my case, increasing it by 3.5x didn't move the needle downward. In fact, it moved a bit in the other direction, a small amount in the other direction, albeit it's probably about the same, 8.8, 9.3, probably the same. But the big take-home message here is that high-dose betaine in my case, and this isn't the only data point that I have, I've done this experiment in the past 2 pre-YouTube video days on my blog where I supplemented with 5 grams per day or up to 5 grams per day of betaine, and it didn't make a dent on my homocysteine. But another part of the story is that I removed a singular supplement that contains methyl B12, methylfolate, and B6 with 1,000 micrograms of methyl B12, 400 micrograms of methylfolate, and 1.5 milligrams per day of B6. So why did I take out that supplement? And could that be the reason why homocysteine may have moved slightly in the wrong direction? And additionally, if this is the best that I can do with high-dose betaine, and even with the methylfolate, methyl B12, and B6 supplement in the approach, only getting to, say, 8.8, what can I do to further decrease homocysteine and get back to that 5 micromolar target, which I've achieved only a couple of times in the past 20 years? So for that story, we're going to do a deep dive into homocysteine metabolism. And I should say this is where the most fun that I have on the channel is. It's doing deep dives into the biochemistry of trying to optimize biomarkers. So starting with dietary intake of folic acid, that's converted into serum folate by MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. That's a protein. Now, enzymatic activity of that protein requires FAD, and synthesis of FAD requires vitamin B2 or riboflavin. So with that in mind, in terms of the supplemental approach for decreasing homocysteine, supplementing with riboflavin an average of 12 milligrams per day for this 41-day period in between tests, that's what I included. And as I mentioned, you can't get 12 milligrams per day in a riboflavin capsule or supplement. I make my own stock solution and then drink a small amount of that every day to get a daily riboflavin dose. Now, 12 milligrams per day is 10x, about 10x the RDA. Maximal absorption of riboflavin in a singular sitting is about 30 milligrams per day, so I have room to go higher. I don't know what's optimal yet for riboflavin levels. And even if riboflavin doesn't help with the folate, the ability of folate and B12 to convert homocysteine into methionine, thereby decreasing homocysteine, I'm going to keep riboflavin, some amount of riboflavin in the supplemental approach and I don't yet have a video on it, but there is published data showing that cells that have a high regeneration capacity have relatively higher levels of riboflavin relative to cells that have a low regeneration capacity. Whether that's true in vivo relative to in vitro, nobody's tested it yet, but I think it makes the most sense to have at least slightly higher levels of riboflavin, at least as a supplement. All right, so then serum levels of folate combined with vitamin B12, which maximizes activity of the enzyme methionine synthase to convert homocysteine into methionine, thereby decreasing homocysteine levels. So in terms of why I took out that supplement that includes B12 or methyl B12 and methylfolate, we can see that from diet alone, I'm getting supraphysiological or greater than physiological amounts just from diet. So for example, for vitamin B12, average intake during this 41-day period was 63 micrograms per day. Note that the RDA is only 2.4 micrograms per day. And I should say too, even if we take out the supplement that I took for a few days during this 41-day period that includes methyl B12, just from the sardines that I eat every day, they have about 8 micrograms per day. So just the sardines alone are 3.5x the RDA. So I should be getting enough B12 from diet. Similarly, for folate, we can see that average intake for this test, average daily intake, was 1,000 micrograms per day, which is 2.5x the RDA. So this is the major reason why I took out these two from that singular supplement that included them, as I figure I'm getting enough from diet, and I can't imagine that they'd make much of a dent by taking supraphysiological supplemental doses. Okay, so now on to how betaine can lower homocysteine. So betaine combines with homocysteine via the action of BHMT, betaine homocysteine methyltransferase, to convert homocysteine into methionine. Now note that BHMT maximal activity requires zinc. So if you're zinc deficient or if you're not getting enough dietary zinc, then activity of BHMT will be suboptimal. Conversion of homocysteine into methionine will be lower, leading to an accumulation of homocysteine. So with that in mind, obviously for this test, I mentioned the betaine supplementation, almost 5 grams per day, but I've also been supplementing with zinc 15 milligrams per day. Now note that my total zinc intake is about 30 milligrams per day, and the Linus Pauling Institute, which studies zinc intake and zinc status, they recommend an upper limit of 40 milligrams per day. So I may need to go a bit higher, but for now, for the pass-through test, I've been supplementing with 15 milligrams of zinc per day, as my dietary intake is about 15 milligrams per day, close to the RDA on its own, which may be insufficient. That's a story for another day, though. Now, there's a third pathway that can decrease or reduce homocysteine, and that's by converting homocysteine in the presence of the amino acid serine and vitamin B6 into cystathionine. Now, I mentioned this in an earlier video a while back, but that might be the best way to decrease homocysteine, as an elevation for cystathionine can then be converted into cysteine, which can then be incorporated into glutathione, which decreases during aging. So if we have a buildup of homocysteine and this pathway is blocked, we could expect to potentially have lower levels of glutathione too, which is like a double whammy, high homocysteine and low glutathione as the master antioxidant within cells. But a key player in this process, which I've ignored until relatively recently, is SAM, or S-adenosyl-methionine. So why is that? It doesn't seem obvious when looking just at the biochemistry that we see here, because SAM, after being converted by methionine, so methionine gets methylated into S-adenosyl-methionine, and after SAM is produced, it's converted into S-adenosyl-homocysteine, or SAH, which is then converted back into homocysteine. So there's no homocysteine lowering there, you're just going in a loop. Similarly, S-adenosyl-methionine inhibits MTHFR activity. So if SAM is high, we'd expect to see potentially higher homocysteine because MTHFR would be inhibited, thereby reducing the ability of folate to combine with B12 to decrease homocysteine into methionine. So that could be potentially bad news there too. But on the other hand, we can see that when SAM is relatively high, that increases CBS activity, or cystathione beta synthase activity, which is required to convert homocysteine into cystathionine. Now note that I've experimented with this pathway in the past, supplementing over 3 tests with 2, 4, and 6 grams of serine per day in conjunction with relatively high B6 intake, and it didn't decrease homocysteine. But S-adenosyl-methionine may have been a key player in that process. And before going more into that story, I want to detail why this metabolite may be so important, not just for homocysteine, but in aging overall. And that's because we can see that to convert methionine into S-adenosyl-methionine, it requires ATP, or energy. Now, as we all know, mitochondrial energy production declines during aging. So ATP would be lower in relatively older animals or people, thereby reducing the ability of methionine to be converted into S-adenosyl-methionine and relatively low S-adenosyl-methionine levels. Under those conditions, we'd expect to see less transit of homocysteine through that cystathionine and potentially increased glutathione pathway. So aging, less SAM production, buildup of homocysteine, decrease for glutathione. Seems like a pretty bad mix of stuff going on there with S-adenosyl-methionine at its core. Is low S-adenosyl-methionine the bottleneck in my data? And if so, if I can relieve that, can I get further below that 9 micromolar value that we saw for the most recent 2 tests? So I can indirectly measure S-adenosyl-methionine levels by looking at levels in plasma of sarcosine and glycine, and that's what we'll see here. So S-adenosyl-methionine combines with glycine, actually it donates a methyl group to form sarcosine, and we can see that addition of the methyl group attached to the nitrogen atom. Now this reaction is catalyzed by GNMT, glycine N-methyl transferase. And that's important. Well, I should say that's important because GNMT has a longevity story on its own, which will likely get its own video at some point in the future. But if we assume that GNMT is a constant during aging, which may not be the case, it may actually decline or increase. But if we assume that it's a constant, if sarcosine divided by glycine is high, then it suggests high levels of S-adenosyl-methionine. Sarcosine levels should be low when SAM is low because that methyl group from SAM is directly donated to glycine, thereby forming sarcosine. So taking it a step further, is sarcosine divided by glycine as an indirect index of S-adenosyl-methionine levels, is that correlated with homocysteine? So the first step in that process is measuring sarcosine and glycine, which I've been doing with at-home metabolomics. I have 21 tests. Actually, I have data for 20 tests. I'm waiting on test number 21, which includes plasma data for sarcosine and glycine, but also 621 other metabolites. So if you wanted to use this kit on your own, discount link in the video's description. So on to the data. On the y-axis, we've got the sarcosine to glycine ratio, again, as an index of S-adenosyl-methionine levels, and that's plotted against venipuncture levels of homocysteine on the same day. So the IOLO kit is using the tasso, and on the same day, I did venipuncture. So I'm directly comparing data generated on the same day. And what we can see is that there's a significant inverse correlation between this index, the sarcosine-glycine ratio, with homocysteine, as that correlation coefficient is negative 0.55, and the p-value is less than the significance threshold of less than 0.05. So from this, when sarcosine divided by glycine as an index of relatively high S-adenosyl-methionine is high, homocysteine is correlated with being low. And to illustrate that point, we can see a data point that looks like an outlier. And on that day, which is actually test number 20, the most recent test, or the test that I have most recent data for, I'm waiting on data for test number 1 for the October 27th test. On that day, I supplemented with 1.4 grams per day of TMG. You could say, what does TMG or betaine have to do with glycine? Well, TMG is trimethylglycine, which can be converted into dimethylglycine. And then dimethylglycine can be converted into methylglycine or sarcosine. If sarcosine is high, we'd expect to have a high sarcosine to glycine ratio. So even with S-adenosyl-methionine, it may be possible to increase this ratio by using TMG, at least in my case. That's what that one data point that looks like an outlier would suggest. But when considering 1.4 grams per day of betaine and potentially 5 grams per day of betaine didn't make a dent on lowering homocysteine past 9 micromolar, I'm going to need another way to try to push homocysteine lower. So with the goal of further lowering homocysteine, how can I increase S-adenosyl-methionine, or using sarcosine divided by glycine as an index of that? So the obvious answer is just supplementing with S-adenosyl-methionine, as it's sold as a supplement, with one example shown there. that's in the backup plan for now. That's in the back pocket. More directly or indirectly, I've decided to go with creatine supplementation. And in terms of the why, we'll see that here. So in the liver, GAA, or guanidinoacetic acid, combines with S-adenosyl-methionine to form creatine. So creatine synthesis happens in the liver. Now, creatine supplementation should spare S-adenosyl-methionine, because if we supplement directly with creatine, we don't need to make it, as we have a daily requirement need. So if we're supplementing with it, S-adenosyl-methionine levels should go up by a bit because we're supplementing with creatine, thereby limiting the need for the reaction to actually make it, which then raises the question of how much creatine per day. Well, the daily creatine requirement for 70 kg men, and note that my body weight is a bit less than that, 63.5 kgs or so, is up to 2 grams of creatine per day. Now, I'm not a vegan. I do eat sardines every day, but sardines have relatively low creatine levels relative to other animal products, including beef. So with that in mind, it's possible that I could be creatine deficient and thereby having low levels of S-adenosyl-methionine, as whatever S-adenosyl-methionine that I have has to be used to make creatine. If that's true, if I supplement with creatine 2 grams per day, which that's my starting dose, and I know some of you are going to say, go higher. Maybe, we'll see. First step, 2 grams per day. Try to satisfy any potential deficiency. That's how I generally do it. So if I do that, will that make a dent on lowering homocysteine by increasing S-adenosyl-methionine? So will it work? The next test is scheduled for December 15th, 2025, blood test number 8 in 2025. So stay tuned for that data in a future video, or if you want to see it first, it will be on Patreon a couple days after getting the data in late December. So there's one more video coming in the blood test number 7 analysis in this series, and that's diet composition. So stay tuned for that video coming relatively soon. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where I offer blood test consults and also post at least twice per day in 4 other Patreon tiers. We've also got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done, the clearly filtered water filter, at-home metabolomics, oral microbiome composition, NAD testing with Ginfinity, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, which includes Dunedin Pace, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes the best epigenetic clock of epigenetic clocks, Grimage, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, including Data is my North Star, Figuring Stuff Out is my drug, and the ConquerAging or Diet Trying logo, which I've got on here. Link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.